In Chapter 1, we're going to talk about the different types of musicians. This is important since this is a survey course so that you can get to know the different fields within music and know what possible career opportunities there are if you decide to go into music later on. Now, this is not a complete listing of musicians, but we're going to go over some of the most important types of musicians as it relates to the actual production of and creation of music. So in Unit 1, you have two chapters. In Chapter 1, we're going to talk about the types of musicians: the theorist, composer, arranger, performer, conductor, and educator. Obviously, we're not talking about producers and a lot of other fields that exist within music. We're sticking to a more classical setup here. So we're going to stick with the very traditional roles in music. In Chapter 2, you're going to deal with the piano keyboard. We're going to talk about the layout of the keyboard, and you're going to learn the names of the notes, at least the white keys on the piano. Learning how to use a piano keyboard is actually a very important skill. It will make it easier for you to visualize some of the music theory concepts that we talk about in this course, and it will also help you to understand how to create scales, intervals, and chords. Plus, if you ever want to play some of your melodies on the piano keyboard, you'll now know the names of the notes and how they relate to the actual keyboard. Before we get into the different types of musicians, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of music theory. At its core, theory essentially makes it easier to understand music. It can benefit musicians in a few key ways. As you see, I've listed a few different ways that theory can help a musician below. The first one is it provides a quick introduction to new musical styles. So if you're a musician and you are confronted with a classical era piece, and you understand the theory of the classical period, even if this piece is one that you've never seen before, by understanding music theory, many of the concepts in the piece, many of the segments in the piece should seem familiar to you. So theory provides this core foundation of understanding that allows you to quickly interpret a musical style that already exists, and in some ways it can also help you anticipate new musical styles that may come about in the future. If you're a composer or an arranger, music theory can help you create a representative work in a particular style. Let's say you're an arranger who needs to create a piece that sounds like Mozart, or let's say you need to edit one of Mozart's pieces to make it a little bit shorter. If you understand music theory, then you can analyze the piece and figure out what chord progressions and what types of voice leading and other theoretical aspects of the piece are common to that particular piece, and then you can edit the piece as necessary. It just makes it a little bit easier to create derivative works if you understand the structural foundations of an existing piece. Theory is also useful to provide you with insight into where music comes from and how it has developed. It also helps with the detection of errors in a musical work. If you understand music theory and you're playing a new piece and something sounds wrong, you can then review the piece with a more intelligent outlook on how it's put together, and you can figure out if that strange section is actually intended, or if maybe it was an error in the typesetting process when they were actually engraving the music. If you're playing a new piece and you come across a section where it just doesn't quite seem right, then if you understand music theory, you can use that knowledge to analyze the rest of the piece and see if maybe there's an anomaly here, if there's an error in the musical work. So music theory really does help with the detection of errors in a musical work. And it does that by giving you a solid foundation and a tool set that you can then use to sort of reverse engineer a composition. So that way you can figure out whether or not the error is intentional, or maybe if it's something that occurred during the notation process when somebody was typesetting the score. Another important aspect of music theory is that it develops logical and critical thinking skills. In a lot of ways, music theory is like mathematics. You have to approach it in a very systematic way. But because you're dealing with sound instead of numbers, it's a very abstract, logical, and critical application. So music theory will challenge your ability to uncover the puzzles of music and figure out exactly what was going on. And it's not always straightforward, because the thing you have to remember about music theory is that music theory is really, it's not going to apply perfectly to every composer that ever existed. If you go back to the classical period, music theory will pretty well describe the music of Mozart and Haydn. It works really well for the most famous composers of any time period. But when you start to get into some of the lesser known composers who are still famous, like Gluck, the music theory suddenly won't work so well anymore. So what you have to understand about music theory is it's simply the theory of the most successful and prominent composers of a particular time period. And the decision to say Mozart and Haydn are more successful than Gluck is really subjective, but they are the most representative composers of a time period because they took everything that existed at the time and managed to put it into one very cohesive and polished final product. And so that's why we consider them masters, because they really mastered the art of what was happening around them. They were able to look at what everybody else was doing and create music that was just on a different level. So ultimately, the benefits of music theory will help a musician to understand and analyze a piece on a much more intelligent level. It's basically, music theory is a study of how a musical work is put together. So let's talk about the theorist now. The theorist has the job to analyze music to uncover basic principles that guide the structure of a piece. Essentially, a theorist will analyze and uncover principles in existing works. Now, the theory that you'll be learning in this class is essentially the theory of the classical period. So again, that's about 1750 to 1820. What a theorist does is they work to analyze the music of composers, to find out what makes them tick, to find out the things that they do in common. So you'll take a piece by Mozart and you take a piece by Beethoven, and you can compare them side by side, and you can say, hey, both these composers are doing the same exact thing. They're using the same kind of chord progressions. This must be a trend of the classical period. So then you create guidelines based on this. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at music theory, but it's a good way of kind of giving you an idea for how the theorist actually comes to their theories. They'll take a catalog of works and find the commonalities between the different composers and even within a single composer's work. A music theorist doesn't necessarily teach, but they do provide learning tools for musicians to understand music on a more analytical level. So a theorist creates this concept of major and minor scales, and then musicians can go through a piece and say, hey, this piece is written using the C major scale. So immediately, the musician has more information about the piece. They know what to expect. It's a great tool for sight reading and for understanding music on a more sophisticated level. Theory also makes it easy for musicians to learn about a wide variety of styles, since a theorist is going through thousands of scores and condensing these scores to a few fairly simple rules. It takes an entire genre of music and sort of gives you the cliff notes for that particular style of music. This next point is a pretty important one. Develops techniques and tools for musicians to imitate the style of existing works. Now the key word there is imitate. So a music theorist doesn't create anything new. That's more the realm of the composer, which we're going to talk about next. But what a theorist does is they look at music that already exists and they figure out the common trends, as I've said before. So These techniques and tools that theorists create can be used by other musicians who maybe aren't composers to imitate a piece in the style of Mozart. It makes them better able to write effective works that are derivative of another composer's works. But the important thing here is that the theorist doesn't really create anything new. They just extract information from what already exists. So the theorist is focused on discovering the common trends and methods used by a particular composer, school, or musical period. So now we're going to talk about the composer. Composers push the envelope of what is possible musically, and they aim to create new works that aren't based on existing compositions. So a composer goes out, they study music theory, they learn an instrument, they become very familiar with how music works. And then what they do is they go out and they try and create something new. Now, not all composers will actually create works that aren't based on existing compositions. But in the academic sense, a composer is trying to create something new, trying to create new sounds and new ways of expressing ideas through music, which is essentially just organized sound. So composers bring new music and sounds to the world. That's really the highest goal that a composer can hope to achieve. If they can create something that hasn't been done before, then they've accomplished something. That's not to say that all composers only strive to create something that's entirely new, because that would be very difficult. But creating something new does require an understanding of what already exists, so theory makes it easier to learn about existing music. Theory also contributes to the composer's understanding of how music develops. So this is especially useful for young composers. By studying music theory, you have more information that you can use to study a musical work. And this is extremely important because if you know how the composers of the past developed their works, you can start to understand why they did it a certain way, and you can start to realize why the forms that they used are so effective. It also provides you a set of training wheels as a composer so that you don't make a lot of the mistakes that the composers of the past have already spent their lifetimes resolving. So theory makes it possible to avoid reinventing the wheel by providing a concise synopsis of the guidelines that composers of the past used to create musical works. And finally, there is another way of teaching composers how to write music that doesn't involve music theory. It's sort of a subset of music theory. It's a concept known as counterpoint. And composers used to rely on this concept to learn how to create musical works. Counterpoint was essentially you take one melody and then you use these very particular rules to create a second melody that goes along with that first melody. So now that you have these two melodies playing at the same time, you've created harmony. And then counterpoint can get really complicated where you have three or more voices working at the same time. So before we had music theory, we had counterpoint. And what counterpoint was focused on was the horizontal melodic aspects of the work. Music theory focuses on the vertical aspects of the work, so the chords and the harmony. Music theory combined with counterpoint provides a powerful tool for any composer who wants to create complex musical works. So if you're considering going into the field of composition, you'll have to learn counterpoint and music theory to really get the full gamut of tools at your disposal. Somewhat related to the composer is the arranger. An arranger is a musician who takes a musical work and modifies it to create something new. They are the most likely musician to take an existing piece and create a new work from the composition. So you might take a famous piece, say Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and you might decide you're going to change it into something different. You want to make an arrangement of this piece. So instead of writing it in major, which is a very happy sounding key, you decide to write it in minor. And what this does is it takes that happy song and makes it a little more sad, a little more dark. It changes the meaning of the original work. Now, not all arrangements will aim to create such a stark contrast between the original and the new ensemble, but an arrangement could go that far if the arranger wanted to suit a particular purpose. So essentially, arrangers create something new based on an existing work. An oral and theoretical understanding of chords and chord progressions, which they learn from music theory, allows the arranger to select the right musical colors for a composition. We often refer to chords and different sounds within music as colors, like you're coloring the composition. This is an important concept because sometimes when you're talking to non-musicians, you can't be talking about major, minor, augmented chords, seventh chords, and all the different types of chords that we have. So to make it a little bit more accessible, we can refer to the colors of a composition using adjectives. We can say that piece has a very rough coloring, has a very dark coloring. The coloring is very bright. This is a very morose section. We can use adjectives to describe a piece, even without the knowledge of music theory. But music theory is going to be important if you're trying to actually construct a piece, because what is a morose chord? We don't know. It doesn't have any particular theory behind it. It might be a minor chord, it might be an augmented chord, it might be a diminished chord, it might be any of these chords. So music theory gives us very specific tools like palettes on a color wheel to allow us to paint a composition using a more reliable and effective set of tools. And then you can always modify these chords as well to create something new if you like. So theory helps arrangers avoid mistakes by learning how to properly voice chords and ensure the harmony balances with the melody. One point I'll make about balancing the harmony with the melody. A conductor does that too. A conductor can take a poor arrangement where the harmony is too thick, and that might be because there are simply 50 instruments playing the harmony and only one playing the melody. Well, the melody's not going to come out in a composition like that. So the conductor's job would be to balance the harmony and the melody by making modifications to the actual piece, maybe telling some of the players to lay off the harmony, and maybe reinforcing the melody by asking the soloist to come to the front of the stage, or maybe even mic the soloist in a more popular concert. So there is a difference between the way an arranger balances harmony and melody and the way a conductor balances harmony and melody. And it's important to know the distinction. With an arranger, they are trying to create a piece that's balanced on paper to begin with. So if they have 2 oboes and 2 flutes playing a particular piece, they're not going to want to have 3 of those instruments playing the same harmony line and 1 of those instruments playing the melody. They're going to want to divide it up so that it naturally comes across in a balanced way. Whereas a conductor will then try and adjust the individual players, have some play softer or louder to create a balance with the melody. So that's 2 different ways of balancing the melody there with the harmony. The performer. This is a person who sings or plays an instrument in a concert. I think most of you are probably familiar with a performer. They are the musicians who are most likely to be called on when it comes time to create a recording of a new musical work. Theory helps the performer visualize and conceptualize a piece, which makes it easier to memorize a work. So if you are a performer, and let's say you're an opera singer, and you have to go sing a 3-hour opera, how do you memorize 3 hours worth of music? And often these opera singers will memorize several pieces. One of the ways they can do this is by dividing the work up into smaller sections. And theory makes that much easier to do. If you understand that this is key area 1, this is key area 2, this is the first part of the melody, this is the second part of the melody, this is how the phrasing of the piece works. There's that dominant chord that's very prominent in the orchestra. When I hear that, I know I'm coming in within 6 beats. Things like this. Music theory will actually help you to stay on track and come in on time. And it also helps you memorize the music because you have this baseline of chords and scales and structures that you already understand before you even approach the new piece. So performers can also use theory to make intelligent changes to a particular part, which can make the work more suitable to the performer's skill level. So if there's a piece that you need to play and there's 1 or 2 parts that you can't play, if you understand music theory, while it's not ideal, you could modify the piece to make it a little bit easier for you to play without completely destroying the structure of the composition. Improvisational skills can also be improved through the study of music theory and learning how chords and progressions function. So if you're a performer that understands the structure of music, then you are better equipped to improvise. You're better equipped to kind of make it up as you go along. And this is more typical of a jazz or blues setting. But understanding music theory just gives you a leg up on the competition and gives you more information to work with as a performer. Now we have the conductor. The conductor is responsible for making sure the ensemble plays in time. Conductors also play a major role in the interpretation of music. Remember, I talked about how the conductor is responsible for the entire balance of the orchestra or whatever ensemble they're conducting. They're responsible for making sure the melody line comes out. They're responsible for the tempo of the piece, how fast or slow it goes. They're responsible for the interpretation of the piece. They play a major role in how that performance is going to end up sounding. A poor conductor could take one of the best orchestras in the world and have a flat performance. A great conductor could take a mediocre ensemble and have a great performance. So the conductor really has a crucial role in how the music is received. Essentially, conductors are responsible for how a musical work is interpreted. It's their interpretation. When you go to a concert, pay attention to the conductor's name. If you like the performance, seek out more works by that conductor, because it's very likely that you like the composer's work, but it's also just as likely that you liked the conductor's interpretation of that work, because different conductors can create entirely different interpretations of a composer's work. The composer writes the music, but it's really the conductor's job to interpret it and bring it to life. Theory makes it easier for a conductor to identify important melodic components, such as motives, in a musical work. So a motive is just one of the smallest complete musical ideas, and sometimes they're not all that complete. But a motive is what sort of builds a composition. You can create a melody out of several small motives. It's something that we don't really get into in this class because a motive is more a function of form, and this is a theory class that doesn't deal with form and analysis. But it's important to know that melodies typically consist of smaller motives that you can identify, and composers, what they'll do is they'll take these small motives or building blocks, if you want to think of it that way, and rearrange them in different ways to create really fascinating works. This next point is pretty important. A knowledge of how music is constructed makes it possible to identify new sections in a score visually, and it does much more than just allows you to identify new sections. When you understand how music is put together as a conductor, you're sitting there with your score quietly, and you haven't yet brought it to the orchestra. Maybe you haven't heard this piece before. Maybe it's a new piece. Your knowledge of music theory will allow you to dissect the piece and learn the piece before you've ever had the orchestra attempt to play it. And this is important because it allows you to get a feel for how the piece should develop, the pacing, how fast or slow it should be, where the important sections are, which instruments have the melody, which instruments have the harmony, how the instruments should interplay with each other. Perhaps there's a melody that switches between the violins and the oboes and it goes back and forth. Understanding music theory and having a good ear will allow you to identify these important elements before you even get to the rehearsal stage, and that can save time and make your rehearsals more productive. So theory helps isolate important musical elements that need to be accentuated in a score. The last type of musician I'm going to talk about is not really a musician, although they probably have a very solid understanding of music and they probably play an instrument extremely well. Many educators often play in local or even professional ensembles and orchestras. But the educator must have a solid understanding of music theory to explain concepts in more than one way. They may teach in a variety of situations and can be found in private and public schools, studios, colleges, universities, and other educational institutions. So educators are stewards of knowledge who must pass down their understanding of music theory. In a lot of ways, they are the guardians of our knowledge. They are the ones we go to understand concepts or to learn more about something. So they provide an essential role in the education of all other types of musicians. They must have a firm grasp of music theory. In studios and grade schools, teachers are often responsible for teaching concepts and helping students learn the material. So before college or university, the teacher will play a very active role in the education of the student. They will actually teach the students concepts. In a university setting, it's often a little bit different. While it can vary depending on the professor, in a university setting, professors are more concerned with imparting knowledge and leaving the learning aspect up to the student. The professor is supposed to be there to provide the information that students need to conduct further research and investigation on their own. How far the student goes is up to the student. If the student decides to do the bare minimum to get a B or a C in the course, that's up to the student. But professors don't usually teach concepts as much as they impart knowledge where the student is then expected to learn on their own. So the professor is a guide, whereas the teacher actually teaches. So educators should understand how musical systems are formed and created to provide more in-depth explanations of musical concepts when needed. So these are all important fields within music. You're going to be tested on this in your first quiz, so make sure you understand the difference between each one of these musicians.